What's up, everybody? This is Gabby Staten Island. Before we start today's video, I wanted to apologize in advance for the crummy audio on this podcast. It's the reason why we haven't released it sooner. I was considering re-recording it because I selected the wrong mic and it doesn't really sound as good as it should. But what I decided was this content from Del was so amazing and spontaneous that I didn't really want to lose it by re-recording it. And the truth is, he's doing most of the talking. So I know every now and again I'm asking some questions here and there, and it's not going to sound that good. But the stories from Del, I think, are really worth tolerating it, and I hope you guys do too. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoy this podcast with my friend Del.
What's up, everybody? This is Gabby from the Craft Growers Network, and I'm excited to do another podcast with you guys today. Of course, as always, we've got Nick Wolf.
Hi, guys.
And then our special guest is Del Potter. He has an amazing story that not only do I think you've never heard, you'll probably never hear another story like this again. He's got an amazing cannabis history, and also he's a modern-day psychedelic pioneer, a modern-day psychedelic pioneer. So I think we should just get into it. Del, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself? And then I'd like you to start as early on in your story as you can, like even the first time you were exposed to cannabis.
Sure. So my background and training is in medical anthropology. And I ended up specializing in a branch of that called psychiatric anthropology. I was really focused on using the anthropological perspective to sort of transform the way we approach mental health interventions and psychiatry. And that was really, my focus throughout my academic years. I had some clinical training at the San Francisco Psychoanalytic Institute, and thought I was kind of going to go in the direction of being a clinician, a more informed type of clinician. Didn't use psychology as the basis, but rather anthropology, which I thought asked different questions. We ask the same questions of a person that you would ask of a culture. How does this person exist in the world? Where do they get their food from? How do they survive? Who are their relationships? And that, to me, that perspective was more, I think, beneficial than psychology, which focused far more on intrapsychic factors. So I started out looking to be a clinician, and then I had a really transformative experience early on, and that was I went to a party, a faculty party at UC Berkeley at the anthropology department. And again, it was a different
What year
time.
was that?
It was 1971, 1971, 1972. I was really struck by first of all, let me just describe this party. Everyone was dressed in period costume, like from the 19th century. There was a guy who looked exactly like Mozart playing the piano. And he was playing perfectly Mozart piano concertos. And this is kind of what I found is that anthropologists tend to be Renaissance people. That is, they have talent in all these different areas. And so I'm walking around this party, and there are luminaries in anthropology, Paul Rabinow and Clifford Geertz, people who are pretty famous, and they were arguing about some aspect of how we interpret culture and stuff like that. So I'm kind of bouncing around this party, and I see a bunch of people that are kind of collected in a group, and it's mostly undergraduates, and everybody's smoking weed. Faculty, students, everybody's smoking weed. There's a haze of weed throughout the room, and I'm holding a glass of red wine. And I walk over, and it's this researcher who I'd actually been at a seminar at Esalen, which if you guys aren't familiar with Esalen, I'll tell you a little bit about that. but it was the researcher Claudio Naranjo. He's pretty famous for doing the early ayahuasca studies and developing a kind of an approach to shamanism and teaching shamanism. So I had met him at Esalen, and so I walked over. He recognized me, and we just started, chatting. And he said, "Look, you would really like to meet Alexander Shulgin. I'm going to be going to their salon get-togethers that they have on Friday nights. Would you like to come with me?" And I'd heard about Alexander Shulgin, and I was like thrilled to come, to some event like that. So I ended up meeting him, and we went to, and I met Alexander Shulgin and his wife for the first time, and a number of other people who were sort of 60s icons. Alan Ginsberg.
Do you mind? For many people may not know who Shulgin is. Can you just briefly tell who he is?
In many ways, the father of modern psychedelic chemistry. He didn't invent MDMA, but he discovered a more efficient synthesis route than anybody had previously. And he experimented with novel chemistry. He invented 2CB. He worked with DMT, 5-methoxy-DMT, a whole range of tryptamines and phenolamines. Basically, phenolamines being mescaline-type related compounds, tryptamines being LSD, psilocybin, DMT related compounds. And he played around with novel chemistry in all of these areas and developed many of the psychedelic compounds that have become the basis of research today. And his wife, Anne, was a psychotherapist, and she kind of bridged the chemistry to the person in a way. So these salons were pretty intense meetings. All these people who were, icons, as I said, in the 60s. Ken Kesey would be there. Allen Ginsberg, Alan Watts. I met Terence McKenna there. A lot of very interesting people would show up, and it was a highly charged intellectual atmosphere. What I really liked about it was real interdisciplinary. You'd have artists, you'd have musicians, you'd have chemists, psychedelic chemists, you'd have psychologists and psychiatrists all interacting and finding a lot of common ground together. Well, so Claudio Naranjo takes me to this meeting, and I'm introduced to Shulgin for the first time. He says, "Hey, I understand you're interested in research around the short-acting tryptamines," because I was doing research on ayahuasca and indigenous use of ayahuasca at that time. And he said, "Look, I'd love to talk chemistry with you." And he kind of gave me a master class over about a year's period in that genre class of chemicals, the short-acting tryptamines.
Is short-acting, I'm sorry, quick question. Is short-acting just mean like rapid onset?
Both rapid onset and short duration. Okay. DMT, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, the experience is almost over. And within half an hour, you're back on the ground. You're maybe a little sparkly, but, it's a very short acting experience. And 5-methoxy-DMT is not dissimilar. So that really changed my direction, meeting him. I ended up going more in the direction of specializing in neuropharmacology and chemistry, and just kind of altered my life's path. When I went to that party that night, I saw Allen Ginsberg. He was sitting on the floor writing poetry, and I had met him before at a conference, one of the earliest psychedelic conference that MAPS put on, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which now is pretty famous for bringing forward MDMA as a treatment for PTSD. They've had uneven success, but back then they were first starting out, and this was one of the first psychedelic conferences. And I remember I had met Allen Ginsberg at this thing. He was on a panel with a Buddhist teacher named Trungpa and Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, the other half of Timothy Leary. And the panel, well, I thought was really funny because, and it immediately, I had some immediate affinity with Allen Ginsberg because somebody in the audience asked the question, when was the last time you took LSD? And Trungpa said, oh, it was about 10 years ago. Now I found this new path. I don't need it anymore. It opened the door for me, but now I found, a way to maintain that type of state without drugs. And then Ram Dass kind of said the same thing. He said, I haven't had it for 5 years. I've opened the door and now I'm going through. And Ginsberg got up there and he said, well, I'm on it now. I thought it would be appropriate for me to take it, like an hour before this panel. And I was immediately, oh yeah, that's my guy, and I saw him later on and he asked me if he could get a ride back to San Francisco. And I had him in the back of my car driving back to San Francisco. So I'm asking this guy every question about Jack Kerouac, about Neil Cassidy, all the beats. And, when I went to Shulgin's party, he saw me and he immediately recognized me. So that party was really a turning point for me. I decided, these people were inspiring, and, it was a different time back then. It was a time when drug manufacturing and drug trafficking, I think, was more or less looked at as a high calling. It was a very special kind of group that Shulgin represented, and they inspired me. And I looked up to him, and I wanted to grow up to be a drug trafficker and manufacturer myself, and we had kind of an idea that this was a messianic purpose. We were out spreading the psychedelic message, and, the laws were not really important to us. It was a time also, I should say, of civil disobedience. The war in Vietnam was still underway, and people were protesting against the value system that kind of supported that war. So drug trafficking, drug manufacturing was looked at as a kind of civil disobedience. It wasn't looked at.
How old were you in 1971? Just out of curiosity.
I was 19.
Okay, cool.
So I was, young and easy to lead around, and I had taken LSD when I was 15, and that experience was transformative too for me. It kind of sent me in a particular direction, and it was Owsley LSD. It was an Owsley double dome, which I think you were supposed to split them in half, but I just took the whole thing, which ended up being about 300 micrograms. So it was a pretty powerful experience. It was, I connected to universal consciousness, floated above my body, a lot of stuff happened. And to me, that message translated to, I want to spread this message. I want to make these compounds available to people. It kind of became that simple. So that was kind of the turning point for me. I continued, I did a lot of research among indigenous groups throughout Latin America, trying to learn and understand about the history of psychedelic use. I worked with the Cofan in Colombia, the Shuar in Ecuador, the Yanomami people in Brazil. And I spent quite a bit of time with the Yanomami people in Brazil. That's where I had kind of my first DMT experience. And this had been previous to when I went to that party at Shulgin's. I had what they do is they have a blowgun that they use to hunt birds, and they get seeds and botanicals that are high in 5-methoxy-DMT and DMT, and they make like this bolus, and they put it in the bamboo blowgun, and you put it up your nose, and another guy blows it up your nose, right? And I think they were trying to teach me a lesson about dosage, and that hit the back of my throat, and I was suddenly higher than I ever could possibly imagine being in like seconds. It's like being shot out of a cannon. And foreground and background changed places. My unconscious came forward and my conscious mind receded. And I was like, whoa, this is something else. So that's why I got interested in the shorter acting tryptamines, was from that experience. So I ended up doing a lot of this research. I also did research among the Mazatec in central Mexico at a little town called Huautla de Jimenez, which was famous for introducing psilocybin mushrooms to the world in 1957. A J.P. Morgan banker, R. Gordon Wasson, who had written a book called Soma, The Divine Mushroom of Immortality. And that book, he pitched the idea that in the Vedic scriptures, there is a description of a substance called Soma, which produces enlightenment. And he argued that it was Amanita muscaria that was being talked about, that red mushroom with the white flecks on it. And he was the first one to lead a party that went to Huautla de Jimenez to have a psilocybin mushroom ceremony. And so I went there and did research there. And, while I was there, I was kind of looking around. One of the things I'll tell you is, people don't realize that going to graduate school, that's like a form of slavery. They want to work you as much as possible for like no money. And so I was really having trouble getting by. And I was kind of thinking, I'm going to need some side hustle if I'm ever going to make it through graduate school. And when I was with the Mazatec, this idea just kind of popped into my head. Because they had shown me the mushrooms growing, and I saw them growing. And I said, they showed me the ones that kind of grew easily out of cow patties. Psilocybe cubensis, it's widely used now. That's the mushroom of commerce. But back then, it was just sort of a wild mushroom. And I got this idea. I'm going to culture that mushroom. I'm going to take the cultures into the United States. I'm going to figure out how to grow it commercially, and I'm going to start growing them. And that'll be my, little side hustle that will allow me to get through graduate school. So
had you ever grown any mushrooms at that point?
No. I knew a lot about mushroom taxonomy, just from studying ethnobotany with the Mazatec, but I didn't really know anything about cultivation or how to grow them or anything. And so I started reading like mad. And so I was self-taught and set up a motel. Well, I ended up, I'm going to go get some cultures. They said, where you really want to get the best ones are in Chiapas, in Palenque, outside of Palenque. And I had kind of a crude map, and I thought I'd just go down there and I'm going to find these mushrooms, do a live tissue culture, and, isolate that culture, smuggle those cultures into the United States and figure out how to grow them. And, you could find these mushrooms in the United States, in southern latitudes in the rainy season. But the ones that were in the region around Palenque, I was assured were like way better. And, these were the state of the art. So I ended up taking whatever little money I had. My aunt would give me a money for books and, basic expenses. And I ended up putting that into a flight to Palenque and was determined to find them and isolate the culture. And, it was kind of an unusual time in that region because there was a Zapatista uprising. And if you don't know about the Zapatistas, they were a collection of indigenous groups, 4 or 5 different indigenous groups who basically declared an independent state in that area. And the Mexican government was like freaked out. Like, is this going to be the beginning of some kind of indigenous revolution? And they ordered the army to go down there and mess with them, but the army would not fire on indigenous people. That's a real cultural boundary in Mexico. Indigenous people represent the cultural soul of Mexico, so they couldn't really get the army to interact with them, so they just kind of isolated them. And so I went down to that region at that time, and so it was a little scary. You'd have to go through roadblocks and stuff like that. And so one of the things that distinguishes Palenque are the archaeological ruins there. There are, somebody was standing in the jungle and they saw like a little tiny, piece of rock that they thought might be some kind of indigenous archaeological site. And they started digging and they found a whole city underneath, all this jungle, and a pyramid, and a whole city. And so I was fascinated with those ruins, and I'm thinking, well, how am I going to find these mushrooms? I got to go around. And I was sitting in a cantina, and there was this Mexican hippie who was sitting there in one table, and he came up to me and said, "Hey, gringo, you want to get some mushrooms?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm exactly looking for that. Can you get me some?" And the first day he brings me these like regular mushrooms and is going to try and like sell them to me, and thinking I'm like stupid enough to mistake regular mushrooms for psychedelic mushrooms. And I said, "No, get the hell out of here. That's not going to work." And he came back very apologetic the next day, and he said, "Look, I can take you to where the mushrooms are growing. And I have an uncle who's a shaman, so I know all about these mushrooms." And I said, "Great, let's go." And he says, I'll just charge you a daily fee as a guide." And I didn't have much money, and I was like, "Okay, let's do this." And so we started going out looking for mushrooms. And the first places we went to were super disappointing. I got to this one place, it was really dry. I actually found some mushrooms, but they were all dried up specimens. And we walked through this cow pasture, and these were like some of the sickliest looking cows I'd ever seen in Mexico. And the whole field was like full of these little tiny ticks that they have in Mexico. So I'm walking through in my shorts and, sandals, and then realize that something's crawling on me, and it's some of these little tiny ticks. So I go nuts trying to get them off of me. And the guy tells me, "Hey, those dicks will crawl up any hole they can find and make a home there." And I'm just freaked out, right? So that was,
that's a bad trip.
Yeah, that was one unsuccessful day. And finally, after a number of false starts, he says, "Okay, this is the one. This is the time. We're going." And all the time we're doing this, we have to drive through a military check. And it's a bunch of these kids standing there. They're 17 years old with AK-47s. And they scrutinize me, but they mostly talk to him, right? A gringo and a Mexican together in the same car. They're looking for drugs. There's drugs here somewhere. Some kind of drugs are involved. So they kind of did a cursory search, but they were giving me an eyeball, like, "What are you doing? I know there's something up here." So we went directly to the pyramid in Palenque, which I had been kind of jogging around every morning just for exercise. So we turn around, we go directly to the pyramid, and he finds this trail leading away from the pyramid that goes into the jungle. So we're going through the jungle, and again, I'm in my tennis shoes this time because I wanted a little better footwear. And we're going through the jungle, parrots, a little light rain mist starts falling. And we come out of the jungle and we cross this river. And now I'm up to my waist in a river crossing it. And I'm all, well, the party's over here. I'm going to be soaked for the rest of the day. I hope we find something. And we come out into this pasture that's like this gorgeous pasture with this grass that's like that Hawaiian crabgrass that has like a cushion to it. And in this field are these Jersey cows, some of the most beautiful cows I'd ever seen in Mexico. And there's cow patties throughout this field, and there they are, giant specimens of mushrooms just growing perfectly. And so I put together a little lab in the motel I was staying at in the bathroom, lined it with plastic, and set up a sort of a lab to do the culture work. And I had like a funky glove box that I used and a little pressure cooker with me to make mushroom media, and ended up going back to that spot and collecting all these specimens. And they were gigantic, really vigorous strain or a variety of cubensis. Isolated the cultures successfully, put them into test tubes, and now all I had to do was get them across the border. At this time, again, nobody had ever really thought about psilocybin mushrooms except maybe in Texas and Florida, where they grew wild and they would chase kids out of cow pastures who were looking for them. But nobody had ever thought of growing them commercially. So I had this friend, an older man. His name is George Shaw, and he was, a really close friend who was basically a smuggler. He would go across the border to Nogales on a regular basis, but he was also a coke smuggler and all kinds of other types of smuggling. And I know he was quite adept at getting back and forth across the border because he looked so innocuous. He's about 5'6", looked like he had a big white beard and looked like a leprechaun version of Santa Claus. He was so charming and disarming that people would just never look twice at him. So he had this thermos, and in these days, the thermoses had these sleeves that you could take out. So I stuck the culture tubes inside the thermos, put the sleeve back in. He filled it up with coffee, so it looked like it was just a coffee thermos, right?
But the coffee wasn't hot?
No, the coffee was hot, but it was insulated. It was insulated. There was an insulation between it and the culture tubes. So he just went right across the border. I was waiting in Nogales, and now I had the cultures in the United States. So now I had to figure out how to grow them. So I was living in a little apartment in Berkeley. I figured, I've got to get to a more rural location. And I was just kind of looking around, where should I go? And I ended up looking in Sebastopol, just outside of Santa Rosa. And there's these
where I live now.
Yeah, very small little ranchettes, 2 acres, 3 acres, up to 5 acres sometimes, but quite isolated. And I said, well, this is perfect. I found a rental there and decided, this is where I'm going to do my proof of concept. And I wanted to duplicate what I'd seen in nature. So I researched compost and made a compost pile of washed cow manure, because that was kind of what I saw in nature, and straw, and read about composting and mushroom compost, and got together enough compost for 4 beds that I laid out in various locations. 3 were kind of in direct sunlight. 1 was under mottled sunlight under the canopy of a tree. And then I seeded them with spawn, which I learned how to make, just self-taught. And the ones that were in the sun, they didn't make it. The mycelium didn't survive. I covered it all with plastic. But the one that was under the canopy, it was cool enough that the entire substrate was colonized. And I thought, well, now what I want to duplicate after having colonized this little, I kind of just laid them out on a 4-foot by 8-foot kind of little, about 4 or 5 inch thick compost bed. And I said, well, now I've got to duplicate what happens in Palenque. I'm just going to, make rain. So I'm going to water them. So I pulled the plastic off of them that's all fully colonized and just started, raining on them and thinking, well, that's going to duplicate what I see in nature. After a few days, nothing's happening. I'm getting discouraged. I'm also working at a job, a cultural resource study at Lake Mendocino, which hadn't been flooded at that point, and they were trying to preserve the cultural resources before they flooded it with a dam. So I'm commuting up to Ukiah from Sebastopol, and I have a friend who's kind of watching it, and I said, look, just water this once a day, give it a nice watering, and just tell me if anything happens. And he calls me up and says, hey, I think you should come back because something's going on here. And I come back and there's like 2 little mushrooms coming out of the middle of the bed. I was like astonished, wow, this worked, but if I have to make all this compost to get 2 little mushrooms, that's not going to work, So I continued to water it. And over the course of a week, suddenly a carpet of mushrooms grew, like a whole edge-to-edge canopy. Every single square inch of that bed was covered with mushrooms, and some of them were gigantic. I harvested one that weighed a pound and dried down to about an ounce. Now I have the problem of, I got to pick these things and I got to dry them successfully. My first experiments of drying didn't work out well because I tried to dry at a low temperature because I wanted to, preserve the active principle that was in the mushrooms. And that would actually turn them black because it was like too cold. And I ended up using no, they would just.
It's like oxidizing, right?
Yeah, no, they have this bluing reaction. When psychedelic mushrooms hit the air, they create this bluing reaction, and I was making that worse, like making it even darker with cold air. So what I did is I set these racks up over the heater vents in my house and just started stacking them up, and that started working. They started coming out perfect, really white stems and beautiful gold caps that were look like gold, And at first I was like, I'm going to cut all the tops off and I'll put the stems in the middle and then I'll line the outside of the bag with the caps. And everybody was, well, I'm just going to take the caps. The stems, they must be lesser quality because you put them in the middle. And conceptually, yeah, it's just like everything's so primitive because nobody's ever done it before. I'm going to have to figure out how to make these things presentable and cosmetically appealing, So I ended up understanding that you just have to cut the mushrooms whole, dry them whole, and lay them carefully in the bag. And that way nobody will think that, this is good and this is bad. And so that's how I start packaging them. And they're coming out really beautiful, like all these gold caps and white stems. And well, now I've got to figure out where I'm going to sell them. And I knew a guy because he had lived down the street. His name was David Logan. That's his actual real name. Probably shouldn't say that.
Okay, so we'll cut that out. Hold on,
Yeah.
I'm going to cut that out.
His nickname was DL. And I should say that in those days, in the drug trafficking milieu, everybody had these nicknames. And so his nickname was DL, and he was from Brooklyn, and he was a real character. He had all these sayings. He's kind of a New York guy in California, and he had all these sayings for people. Like he had a guy who drove for him, and he called him, "That's my punk in the trunk." And he would say stuff like "money talks, bullshit walks," and he got divorced from his wife, and he told me, the payments that he had to make to her were the fucking I get for the fucking I got. And he just had all these funny sayings about all this stuff. Really.
What a character.
And yeah, we really hit it off. And he was famous as the guy who was the acid connection at Woodstock. He was the guy who made Woodstock essentially because of all the LSD he brought to it. He wasn't the guy with the brown acid.
He wasn't the brown acid.
He wasn't the brown acid. He was the good acid. And so he came out to California with his partner, and his partner was this guy, Miami Sammy. And we called him Sammy Two Sticks because he was paraplegic and he would run around on two sticks all the time, on crutches. But what was so funny is he had this wheelchair and he decked it out, and he would be in clubs and all over town with this wheelchair, and he had like a mobile bar set up in it, and he had like drawers with all kinds of different weed in it, and it was just kind of like his mobile dispensary he would get around in. So he hooked up with Miami Sammy, came out to the coast, and he just started selling weed and ecstasy and all kinds of stuff in California, and he was pretty much the guy. Started selling Thai weed. At that time there were all these regional varieties of cannabis from around the world, and that's how you sort of identified what the experience was going to be like. You had all these varieties from Mexico, you had some varieties from Colombia, varieties from Thailand, and he started selling Thai weed and became famous for that. Anyway, so I knew, because he sold LSD, that he was probably the likely person I need to bring these mushrooms to. So I brought him to him, and he was like, "Yeah, this is really great, but I don't like the way you're doing this. It's like I'm not involved in any way. You're completely independent. You're basically turning straw into gold here. How are you doing this?" And it kind of upset him in a way, because it upended the supply chain. You didn't have to go to Colombia to get it, and you didn't have to go. You could do it in, and he says, and he started making all these derisive comments like, well, Del, how many mushrooms can you pick? Like I didn't tell him, I can get an army of people to pick mushrooms, but he started making all these derisive comments. He said, "I don't like the way you're doing this, but I'll sell them for you. And here's the cash." And I charged $800 a pound, $50 an ounce.
That's how much he charged, or that's how much you charged?
That's the wholesale price. That's what I charged.
Wow.
And just to put this in perspective, what year was this in?
This was like 1974, 75.
Okay. And today, pounds of mushrooms are maybe like $500 on like the absolute high end, right?
Yeah.
So like $800 a pound in 1971. I mean, we'll have to do some calculations and see how much. I'm gonna actually Google it. Like how much is $800 today? I'm gonna type it in. How much is $800? Because like that sounds like a ridiculous number.
I just figured, I don't know, $50. I mean, it's just, I was throwing darts at a dartboard. I had no idea how to price them.
$6,235 a pound.
Yeah.
Well, that's fair.
He's like, I'll take it.
Yeah. So, I'm selling these things in bulk.
How did people have enough money to buy that? I mean, like that seems like. I mean, I'm glad you got it, but like.
But it's only
like
$50.
$50. I think your calculations may be a little bit deceiving, because Thai sticks retail 2.5 grams Thai stick was $25. So these were exotics, Gaby.
Yeah, but was it like just for the rich? Like how are hippies tripping on shit that costs that much?
An ounce of Colombian was about $40. And that was somewhere above Mexican, but not quite as good as Thai weed. Mexican, $30 an ounce, somewhere in that range. $25 an ounce for lamb's bread from Jamaica. So it did kind of fit in the range, I thought. How many doses? Let's see. We kind of consider 3 grams to be a whopping pretty good dose of mushrooms today. So, I got 28 grams in there. There's quite a few doses for $50, Gaby. I think it works out to $5 a dose. It's not LSD, which was around $1 a dose. But you couldn't get LSD because the major supply chains had been disrupted by the DEA. So all of a sudden, here comes this natural product that you're absolutely sure it is what it is, because look at it, it is. It's not a white powder that you could deceive someone with. It's the natural product. So $50, everybody was paying it. It was no problem. So I think they were going out the door at about 1,000 retail.
Wow.
So, you know, I sold what I had to DL, and then I realized this guy's going to be hard to work with. But I knew another guy. His name was Richard, and he lived out in Inverness, out near Point Reyes. And he was from Red Hook in Brooklyn. All my connects were from New York. And because they know how to manage business, let's face it. And he had a thriving business shipping weed from California to New York. And I showed them to him, and he was like a very well-organized, solid businessman. And he took one look and he says, I will take every pound you can produce. So with that mandate, I decided, well, Sebastopol, as nice as it is with its 2-3 acre parcels here, it's not going to be what I need to create a commercial operation. I'm going to have to get way further out. And I grew a little weed in the yard next to where I was doing the mushrooms, because heck, I'm in Sebastopol. I might as well grow a little weed. And the neighbor kids came over and grabbed some branches. So I knew my security was less than ideal. So I decided, well, I'm just going to have to get further out. So I decided I'm just going to drive up Highway 1 and, find a good place. And I just kept driving, and then everything became more rural and wild. And, I went through Sea Ranch, and I crossed the Gualala River into Gualala. And I'm all, man, this is a really funky little burg here. This looks like the spot, And so I started hanging around trying to find a rental, and I found this guy had a log cabin for rent, and it had outbuildings that were, really sheetrock garages that were just perfect for an indoor grow room. Because I had resolved at that point, it's time to take this inside so I can control all the environmental variables that I can't do outside. I had been reading enough at that point about mushroom growing that I knew kind of what the parameters were, what the environmental controls were. And I was like, okay, let's step this up. So I converted these garages into.
Can I say 1 second?
Yeah.
1 second. You said that you were reading on growing mushrooms, but were you reading on growing regular mushrooms?
Yes.
And not
yes.
psychedelic ones? Because
yes. I was reading on growing regular mushrooms because I figured out these are what are called coprophilic mushrooms. They grow on manure. So I reasoned that the conventional mushrooms, which also grow on manure, would probably have the same nutritional requirements, and cultivation would not be a lot different. So I used that information, and there were some books out there. I found this one that was really good called Mushroom Growing Today, and it was by this English guy who was, sort of one of these English country gentlemen growing mushrooms, in the countryside. And I fancied myself kind of like that. I'm, like a boutique farmer in the countryside growing mushrooms at the small scale like this. And, that book was super instructive. And so I started converting these garages, and I turned one of the bedrooms in this place into a lab. And, I started growing really successfully. And I took the first batches. I had I think I had about 200 pounds out of my first harvest. And I took that to Richard in Inverness, and he was like, cash, here you go. And that just fueled the fire, because he sent that back east and people went nuts. They're all, well, we got to get more of these. And so I said, well, you know what? I got to find something that's even a larger commercial operation. I need to even get more remote and more, more infrastructure. And I was in the feed store, and there was this guy, and he had these turkey barns in Point Arena.
Didn't have a crazy nickname like Johnny Two Sticks and
No. All the guys on the sales side had those names, and we'll get to that. Like Bifocal Bob, who was head of the Jewish mafia in New York, would cash you on any size load that you delivered to New York to his Manhattan warehouse, cash on delivery. Anyway, so I was like, well, he starts talking about some renter he has that has trashed his rental. And I kind of overhear all this and step in, hey, I'm looking for a rental. And he says, well, it's got a 3-bedroom house there, and it's got 10 turkey barns that this guy was using for turkeys. And I said, well, let's go take a look. And these 10 turkey barns are giant commercial buildings with concrete floors with drains, right? And all I got to do is clean them up. And each one of these, they're like 30 by 100. Each one of these 10 turkey barns, I said, I can just fill these things up with mushrooms and get an army of people to help me pick them. And, made the deal with even though the indoor growing was not a thing then, there were all these strange characters running around Mendocino at that time. And, the guy just naturally thought there's drugs in here somewhere, but he didn't care really. Just pay me my $400 a month. That's what he wanted for a rental. And
if you'd have known you were getting
you're good off £1 and then the rest is probably
you might have raised your rent if you would have known.
He might have, so he's all, you can have all the turkey barns, you can have the whole thing. He says, don't bother me. I don't want to have anything to do with this. Just pay me the $400 every month. So I go up there.
How much land was this on?
Like 10 acres.
So,
like,
no one's going to venture on it.
No, and it was way, super remote out. It went up this gated road that I could completely control access to. And I called up my buddy Cowboy Scott. And he was from the construction industry in Southern California. And meanwhile, I'm going to graduate school. And I'm doing all this work on the side, And so I call up Cowboy Scott and I said, this is the guy I need to ramrod this job. He was from the construction industry and he'd run huge crews. And he says, look, I know the team that I can bring for this. And he brought his brother-in-law and all these people up there and just transformed those barns into a mushroom growing facility with environmental controls, with heating and cooling and all this stuff. And he put out a lot of the money. And, I kind of took him on as a partner, not a full partner, but like as a kind of partner, mostly, he brought all these other people. And then the other thing that was super cool is he did grow a little weed, and he knew these Vietnamese families who would do the trimming. And that's who he said, let's use these guys to do all the picking and harvesting and packaging. And so we had a crew making compost, and eventually I actually got machinery to do the compost, and that was inside one of the barns. And then the compost with forklifts and boxes would be distributed to the other barns. And so I had this full-on commercial mushroom farm going.
This is still mid to late 70s?
Yeah. Wow. And suddenly we're producing thousands of pounds of mushrooms, literally, and drying them. And the drying operation now is expanded. I've got forced air heaters and cabinets and shelves and racks, and just tons of mushrooms are getting processed out of this facility. And, I get a call from Richard. He's like, when am I going to see you? When am I going to see you? I put together 4,000 pounds, right? Dried mushrooms. And I had these U-Haul boxes. The dish pack U-Haul boxes. I could put exactly 50 pounds in each one of those boxes. So filled up, all these boxes, put them into a U-Haul, and all I had to do was successfully drive down the coast and to Point Reyes, to Inverness, with these boxes and boxes of mushrooms, 4,000 pounds.
Now, was
right?
it shady? You said all I had to do was drive it to Inverness, but you drive.
Well, I just felt, you've got all this.
Pounds of psychedelics. Well, I'm like, were you nervous or you just?
I was scared out of my mind. It was like,
Did you try to
I just felt like
with like another set of packing in front of all the boxes, or was it just straight up? Like,
no, you couldn't do that because you couldn't do that because there was too many mushrooms. So it was like boxes right to the door.
Holy
you open
shit.
the door, there'd be boxes there, and so I got this all packed.
You know what that reminds me of? Back in the day in Willits, it's not like this anymore. But back in the day in Willits, people would harvest their weed like if they felt the heat was coming or something, and they'd have all their weed in the back of the pickup truck, and people would literally drive down the highway, and you'd see fucking weed like coming out the back of their pickup truck, but they were making an exit.
Yeah, and a lot of times it wasn't dry yet. It was just harvested, pull it up, throw it in the back, and we'll dry it later, And so I had figured, look, I just went all this trouble. You wouldn't believe this thing was working like a Swiss watch. Over here we had the crew making compost. Here we got these Vietnamese families, didn't blink about the work. They're fine with 24/7 picking. And over here we've got the packaging. It was amazing. And so I didn't want, the last minute to have this, to get it seized or, so that ride down the coast was very scary, So I get to Richard and he says, okay, come meet me at my office in Point Reyes. And he passes me a suitcase with millions and millions of dollars. I mean, 2 suitcases actually. And I had people to pay, obviously, but there was significant profit there. Wow. And so I was off to the races at that point and continued to do the commercial mushroom growing for quite some time after that. What started happening was competitors emerged, and then there was kind of a price war. But at that point, I was so far ahead, it didn't really even matter, And at this time, I should say also, the cultural zeitgeist was beginning to change a little bit. Reagan came into office and he was like, the drug war and Nancy, just say no and all that stuff. And people, interest in psychedelics started falling off, kind of fell off a cliff, really. And my demand started really decreasing. People wanted cocaine. All of a sudden, it was exemplified by, I don't know, you've seen that movie, Gordon Gekko, Greed is Good. It was Wall Street, and psychedelics were looked at as kind of an indulgence, like a waste of time. What we want to do is make money in business, and so cocaine emerged as the drug of choice, and people had less and less use for mushrooms. So that was interesting, but I had already started another hobby at that point. Cannabis. I was starting to grow cannabis indoors, the first indoor grows. I had these great facilities, and so I thought, well, I'm going to experiment with genetics.
Can you describe your first indoor grow just in?
Oh, that's funny because
of the era.
Yeah. There was a magazine. This is pre-High. No, High Times was happening, but High Times was a glossy commercial. It wasn't really for growers. It wasn't the nuts and bolts of growing. Another magazine came out that was printed like on newsprint called Sinsemilla Tips.
Out of Eugene or
out of Eugene, Tom Alexander. I'm still friends with him.
I'm hoping I can get him on the show. I've been messaging him.
Yeah, he's a good friend of mine, actually. And I went up to Eugene. I'm reading this, and I'm like, oh, street lights. We got to use street lights inside. And in those days, they didn't have pre-made little, ballasts and everything all pre-made for you. You had to build it yourself from scratch. So I was building it on plywood and stuff, like little plywood boxes and stuff. And you become an expert at electrical wiring yourself. At this point, really, I can wire Hoover Dam if I had to. I've gained so much knowledge about wiring electrical environment. So I went up to Eugene to his grow store, Blue Moon, I think it was called. And this guy's just out there selling these lights, and this is how you grow cannabis indoors. And it seemed kind of ballsy, in a way. He's got a whole store selling this. So I walk in and I buy like 40 lights. And that was the biggest purchase he'd seen at that point. He was like, "Oh my God, let me help you." We became friends.
What year was this?
Like 1979, I think. Like 1979, 1978, 79.
How much were they selling the lights for? Do you remember?
Oh gosh, it was pretty cheap, like $120. Everybody at that time thought, okay, you veg under halides and then you flower under sodiums. And then somebody figured out, well, you could just use the sodiums the whole time. It doesn't, it's not that much different, And so the sodiums were more expensive. They were a little more pricey. I think maybe in the $200 range, something like that. So I get my 40 lights.
Watts?
1,000 watts.
No.
Wow.
Yeah, 1,000 watts.
You sure?
Yeah, positive. Yeah. No, we're not messing around, Gabby. We're growing some weed, okay?
I know you weren't messing around, but I didn't know that the streetlights were 1,000 watts.
Yeah, for sure.
When I first started going to the grocery store, and I'll give a little, not a plug because it's not there anymore, but Ross at East Coast Hydroponics, the biggest he had was a 430 watt light.
Oh no, we had thousands, so anyway, let me just tell you that my first grow, I pack all these lights in. I didn't understand that heat is not necessarily beneficial to the grow. I thought, and then I'd been reading articles about CO2. So I was like, okay, I'm going to jack this up with CO2. We're going to really have a huge production. And I seal the room up and the heat goes through the ceiling. I thought, no problem. That's like, tropical zone, it's not going to hurt anything. And the plants just they produced these flowers that were like one long stalk with a calyx here, a calyx here, a calyx here, a calyx here. They were just so stretched out. They were trying to survive from the amount of heat that was in that room. And I was, it was an interesting actual scientific experiment because you found out that cannabis goes to great lengths to keep the sex cells cool. And if it has to, it will create these long stretched branches just to keep it cool for survival purposes. But if it's cold, and this is what was funny, I had one room that I didn't have any heat in. It was ice cold up, on the coast. And those buds came out beautiful, right? Gorgeous. And I was like, well, I guess you got to pay attention to the heat. And so I started working from that perspective, and things started coming out really good, really, really well. And I knew I had been introduced. There was a guy who lived on the coast, great guy, Herbie Herbert. He was the manager for Journey, the manager for Santana. He managed the Dead for a while. Pretty famous guy in the music business. He had his own group called Cyclops. Famous guy, beautiful human being. He was kind of the one who introduced me to high-end weed, really connoisseur level, because he was nuts for it. And he introduced me. He had all these international visitors at this estate that he had on the coast overlooking the ocean. This was like a park, the way he manicured this entire estate. He had so much money. His nickname was the Pharaoh because he had so much money, right? And so he introduces me to Arjan, the guy who ran the greenhouse in Amsterdam.
Yeah, from Strain Hunters.
Strain Hunters, you're right, exactly. And Arjan and I become really good friends, and he loves the operation I have going. And so we start doing these genetics exchanges. I'm working with what is available in Mendocino. There was a guy named Mean Gene Green who had, some serious genetics at that time. But, we're seeing early skunk varieties, quite unique. And he came up with, he's famous for haze varieties and some really interesting sativas. He hits me up and says, look, this is the best strains I've ever had. I want you to kind of cross them with what you've got, and let's produce some really unique strains. And so I started doing that, and I had some outside growers who would seed huge amounts of crops. So I'm ending up with pounds and pounds and pounds of seeds over a period of time. And these guys, these varieties are unbelievable. I wish I had them today. They were remarkable. This whole one branch of it was all citrus, like lemon, so lemony. It was like someone put a lemon right under your nose. Orange, just like an orange. And then there was this really, really skunk diesely branch. And they were kind of like expressed in those two different ways. They were either this really citrus form, or they were this incredible diesely indica group. And so these were really great. I mean, even by today's standards, I would say.
What year was this?
This was like 1979, 1980.
Wow. So still right around the first year when you were setting up the grow.
Yeah. And so I am collecting all these seeds. And, at the same time, where is cannabis being grown? It's being grown in Mexico. If you want a commercial grow, you either go out into the woods and do this guerrilla thing, which never made sense to me because they got helicopters. And if you get caught, they're throwing away the key, because at that time, cannabis wasn't that distant from heroin. The way they looked at it. So it was a very serious offense. It was a major felony. And so that never made sense to me. Oh, I'm going to go out and risk a giant crop outside, and hopefully it gets through. Hopefully the helicopters don't find it. So I started thinking, where can I grow weed commercially at scale? Because I want to see these varieties grown at scale. And I had this friend who was smuggling from Mexico on the border in El Paso. El Paso and Juarez being sister cities that are separated by a bridge over the Rio Grande. And I actually knew him through this guy named Lloyd. He was a surfer. He had a boutique clothing store in Laguna Beach called Visions, and it sold all these like white flowing hippie clothes. It was really classic for the time. And down the street from that was the Brotherhood of Eternal Love's head shop. And you would go in there. It was like the coolest place because they had all this stuff oriented to psychedelia in there. And next door to it was a record store that sold only bootleg albums. That's all they sold, nothing else. So you go in there, Dylan on the Isle of Wight, Janis Joplin performing at, it was so cool. I'd go in there and grab all these great albums that, they weren't great quality, but they were really cool concerts. So he was kind of in the middle of that, and he knew my friend, I'm going to use a fake name here, Brian, in El Paso, and that's where he was getting the weed from. This guy would ship weed out to California, and Lloyd would sell it. And they were doing tons of weed, tons. And so the entire weed scene was being fueled by these Mexican varieties, which were very poor quality, sticks, stems, not really brickweed, but, just not connoisseur grade weed compared to what we could grow, indoors or even outdoors in California. And so I don't know how it happened, but I just got this idea. I'm going to pitch to this guy. I pitched it to Lloyd first, and I said, look, what if we gave these genetics or made these genetics available to the Mexican cartels that are growing in Mexico? we could grow this at commercial scale, and the quality would benefit everybody. It would benefit the Mexicans. They'd get a higher price. It would benefit the consumers because we'd get quality product. This is a win-win for everybody. So Lloyd thought about that, and he said, you know what? This is a great idea. I want to pitch it to my buddy in El Paso. So he said, get some samples of your weed, and let's fly down to El Paso and pitch this to the cartels. And at this point, Lloyd just kind of handed me off to Brian, and Brian and I became the best of friends. And he's actually one of my best friends to this day. And so we go, I fly down to El Paso, and I'm looking out the window of the plane as we're flying down, and it looks like this scrub brush that you'd see in, California deserts. But there's all these little roads cut through there. And I start thinking, man, you could just easily get lost. And that's how they do this. They smuggle it across the border a variety of ways, either in backpacks or in cars where they jet across. They have all these different methods. And just looking at the plane, I began to see, oh, wow, this is really interesting how they can do this. And so, and his wife, I'm going to use a fake name, Malia, picked me up at the airport. She's driving a classically restored 1960 Cadillac convertible, pink, with a white interior. And they've transformed this car into the most advanced sound system I've ever seen in my life. It's like being in a concert hall. And she has speakers hidden in every vent. You can't see a speaker anywhere. But we get in the car, and it's just like rock and roll city, and we're driving with the top down. And I've got some samples with me that I managed to smuggle on the plane. I did sealed bags, foil bags, and no smell, right? Smuggled it all the way here. And I've got these branches, like about this long,
You're smuggling to Mexico, not from Mexico.
Smuggling to Mexico. But first I got to get to El Paso.
You might have been one of the first people to ever do that too.
That's the potential.
Pioneer of smuggling cannabis to Mexico.
I could be. So I've got these beautiful specimens, and I have some pre-rolled joints also in there. And so Malia is a big smoker, and she's, we love California homegrown down here in Texas. And I pass to the front seat, and she tells me, honey, you and I are going to be new best friends. I said, look, I've got probably about 8 ounces with me. You can probably have half of that. We'll make do with the 4 ounces we have for a show and tell. And she said, oh, honey, we'll smoke that in a week. So California weed was much appreciated in Texas. Let's just put it that way. So we're driving, in this Cadillac, and she puts on the Bobby Fuller 4. I fought the law, and the law won. And I'm just thinking, man, this just frames the trip so perfectly. I was later to understand that Bobby Fuller was a son of El Paso, and it was like a local band. And I'm like, okay, I fought the law, and the law won. Here I am with all this weed in Texas. And so we drive to their house, and the men talk. She leaves. Oh, by the way, let me just tell you one thing about. At any given moment, she's wearing $250,000 to $500,000 of Native American jewelry, diamonds, just decked. It reminded me of one of those African tribes where they stack all those rings up on your neck. I mean, she was just decked in all this jewelry, Rolex watches you've never seen, custom made. And she would complement this just with a silk blouse and Wrangler jeans and cowboy boots, but like $250,000 to $500,000 of Native American custom jewelry of various kinds.
Native Americans didn't get $250,000 though, right?
Well, actually, she had these artists that she supported in New Mexico. She paid them well. Yeah, for sure. And so these people are flying high. I'm impressed. They've been doing tons over the border for years, right? And so I sit down with Brian, and he says, okay, I've made some arrangements. We're going to make a pitch today to the head of the Juarez cartel, a guy they named Greñas. Greñas in Spanish means mop head, kind of. I mean, that's the best translation I can come up with. And he had these sort of reggae-styled locks, that warranted the nickname. And he had started out as he'd gone to school in the United States, sold cars, had some business education in the United States, and went back to Juarez and became the cartel kingpin. Now, you want to fully understand that the person who they put in that position, behind them are the Mexican government, the highest levels of the Mexican government, the richest families in Mexico. And they put this person in place who acts as an intermediary and is sort of easily expendable. If there's any kind of trouble, they put another guy who interfaces with the gringos and does the major brokering to those people on the border. And so it's a job where you're expendable, but at this point, his wealth is increasing. And he is driving around town in bulletproof Rolls Royces and building high-rise apartments and clubs in downtown Juarez. And at this time, now we know Juarez is kind of the murder capital of the world, and people getting disappeared and all this cartel violence. At that point, I should say, and the reason I wasn't totally afraid to do this kind of stuff is that cartels operated differently. They operated on principles of honor, and they would rather bribe you than kill you. And so killing someone was a big deal at this time. It wasn't the bloody enterprise that it later became. So he's establishing himself, and these guys, one of the things I learned was they love quarter horse racing. And so on the feast of the feast of Buenaventura, that's what it was, they took over this town and they had these cartel quarter horse races. And he bet $1 million on his horse to win, and he lost. Then he shrugged it off, like no big deal. And he was an up and coming figure. So we're going to go meet with Greñas, show him my incredibly beautiful purple, weed you've never seen in Mexico, glistening with resin, just gorgeous, right? And really strong smelling skunk, right? And so Brian tells me, okay, let's go. And we get in his Mercedes and we're driving to Mexico. I'm on my way to meet the head of the Juarez cartel.
So you're still in Texas at this point, driving across the border.
Yeah, and I didn't know at this time that Brian was kind of a joker, so he says, okay, I hope you have that well hidden. We're just about to drive through customs, Mexican customs. And I get all nervous. No, I don't have it hidden. And we just sail right through. They don't even look, right? It's just like, yeah, go on. Nobody's looking for weed coming into Mexico. Right. So we drive through Juarez.
Smuggle it there. No one's looking.
So we drive through Juarez and we come to this residential area. Beautiful kind of cul-de-sac, and kind of a normal looking tract house, but it has this giant water tower in the front. And there's all these cartel soldiers walking around in front of it. We call them sicarios, essentially assassins, soldiers. It's a kind of a cultural thing in Mexico to be a person like that. And so these guys were wearing suits and sunglasses and carrying AK-47s just right out there in the open in the middle of this cul-de-sac. And we get out of the car and they're talking on radios, ushering us in, and we go into this water tower, and there's a downstairs and an upstairs. And so downstairs is kind of ring of seats, and I'm ushered into sitting next to this guy who is dressed like a very traditional campesino. And I recognize that, having done a lot of field work among the Mayans, I recognize that he's in very traditional Mayan attire. He has this hat with these little dangles all around the brim, which are designed to keep supernatural forces away from, like, bad luck and, any kind of supernatural intervention away from him. And he's all dressed in white. And that's who I end up sitting down next to, this guy. And I've got my bag with the small branches in it right here. And I start talking to this guy, and I'm talking to him in Spanish, but I use a little Mayan too, just to show off. And he recognizes, he's Mayan. He's like, how does this guy know any Mayan? And he starts kind of warming up, and we're chatting. And I find out, meanwhile, there's a stairway going up to the top of this water tower, and they're bringing in U-Haul boxes. All these people are bringing in U-Haul boxes. Brian leans over to me and says, those boxes are full of money. This is the counting house. They're bringing all the money upstairs to be counted, right? And this is happening while I'm talking to the guy. And so during the course of the conversation, I find out that he is, in fact, Mr. Biggs, in charge of Mr. Biggs Grows. This is the guy who's the agricultural master for all the weed they're growing, right? And I said, well, I'm a bit of a cultivator myself. And Brian had introduced me as a maestro, professor. He said I was a professor, university professor. And so that's kind of how I was introduced to this guy. And so that's a position of real respect in Mexico. And so he's, speaking very respectfully to me. And I said, I'm a bit of a cannabis cultivator myself. And I think to myself, well, now's the time. And so I actually had opened these foil sealed bags, and I had them hand closed. And so I opened them up. I said, I think I have something I want to show you. And I open it up, and I pull out one of these branches. The whole room fills up with skunk smell. And everybody turns around and looks at me and looks at what I've got. And, you've got cartel soldiers taking their sunglasses off like this. What the hell? And he looks at it, and his eyes get as big as saucers. I mean, he's like, whoa. And he composes himself, and he says, Señor, un momento, por favor. And he says, can I have a branch, right? And I say, sure. And he walks upstairs, waves off the guards. They part for, let him by. And he goes upstairs, and all of a sudden I hear all this shuffling upstairs and movement and, like swearing, peachy this and fuck this and chinga tu madre and all this stuff. And he comes walking downstairs, and he's all like, come on. And I'm escorted past the guards to the administrative offices of the Juarez Cartel and Greñas. And now I'm up there. And he's got this giant antique desk, and he's pissed off. He's running around. He's got garbage bags full, and he's looking through these bags, and he's pissed off. And he's saying, peachy buds, peachy marijuana, and basically what I'm coming to understand is he is upset because he believes that some of his pot is equal to my pot. And he's trying to find a representative bud, to show that he can do just as good as I can, right? And he's going through these bags, and he's all upset like this. And he finally comes up with like a bud, like about like this big. My buds are like this big, giant fucking indica buds. And he holds it up next to us. See? Just as good. Lo mismo. And there's a moment of silence where everybody in the room acknowledges that they're not even close. And in fact, his little tiny bud, everything's machismo in Mexico. There's an innuendo, sexual innuendo. My big one is better than his little one, And kind of suddenly there's a moment where he kind of realizes that. And he's kind of calms down, and he's like, okay, but there's a few more peachy buds, fuck your buds, a few more of those. But he sits down, and he puts his feet up on the desk, and he says, okay, let's have a chat. And he's wearing this starched white shirt white hat. There's a style of dress. They call it the Sinaloa style. Big old belt buckle with a Mexican gold coin in the middle of it, stitched boots, crisp white shirt. They've got this whole way of looking. And he's sitting down at his desk with his feet up, and he reaches into his shirt pocket and he pulls out a little baggie, and it's filled with base, Coke base. And he pours it out on the table, and he takes out a package of Marlboro cigarettes and carefully undoes the cigarettes, takes the tobacco out, right? So it's just like a little flaccid cigarette. And he mixes the tobacco with the base, and then he starts stuffing it back into the Marlboros, right? And then he sits back and lights up, and he's just smoking cigarette after cigarette of this. And I'm like, how is this guy even mildly coherent? He's just smoking all this base while we're having this chat, right? Anyway, he says, okay, I like what you've got. Tell me about it. How would this work? I said, well, I have seeds, and there's also a new process called cloning that, we can use to even accelerate the amount of viable plants that we have. And he said, oh, yeah, tell me about that. And so I kind of tell him about that. And so, as time goes on during the discussion, he starts becoming convinced, yeah, this is a great idea. And he goes over to a file cabinet and pulls the file cabinet open, takes a file folder out. He says, let me show you where you're going to be growing. He lays these Polaroid pictures out on the table. And I look at these Polaroids, and the vast lime green fields on white desert sand, just as far as the eye can see, just huge, giant grows. And I'm thinking, wow, this is incredible. But one of the things I noticed in the photographs is there's Mexican army guarding these fields, Mexican army half-tracks, Mexican army helicopter, Mexican army, soldiers with machine guns guarding these fields. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? And I say to him, ¿Qué es esto? He said, we buy the army. We have a relationship with the Minister of Defense. And he takes out our competitors' fields, and we pay him, and he takes care of our fields. So I'm like, wow, this is like wired to the highest levels of government. And, that's why, to some extent, getting the story out there, I don't know if the Mexican government would look favorably on me telling this story, but it's true. So he says, okay, this is...
The story's from 50 years ago already, or 40 years ago.
Fair enough.
This stuff has come out. I don't think anyone in current government's going to care.
So he says, okay, this is how it's going to work. I'm going to give you a percentage of the load. I will be able to get it. I will do all the crossing of the border. We will ship it to your markets in New York in commercial vehicles, and to San Francisco. You have markets in San Francisco and New York. I'm kind of one-stop shop. I bring the genetics and I bring the market, And so he says, this is very good. And he says, I'll give you a percentage. And just one thing, bring me those fucking semillas. I want those fucking semillas. And he says, you fuck me on this and you work with anybody else, I will cut your balls off and feed them to you. He literally says that. And so we drive away from this meeting, and I think I've got it made. This guy's going to handle everything. All I got to do is impart some cultivation knowledge, supervise the grow, and supply all the seeds and clones and set up a cloning operation. This is going to be perfect. Turns out he wanted help with all aspects of his smuggling operation. He's like, I'm having trouble. I want to make sure it doesn't mold. I want to make sure that, there's no smell in the packaging. And so I found these packaging machines, for him. This place in San Rafael does industrial, sealed bagging, and injects nitrogen into it, was unusual then, not so unusual now, but injects nitrogen into it so, it prevents mold. And I go away from this thinking, man, I have got it made, And so we start scaling up, and I start going over to Mexico. And come to understand that these seeds and clones are going to the cartel's operation called Rancho Buffalo, which is a giant plantation in Chihuahua. Hundreds and hundreds of acres, thousands of acres, literally. And I'm just funneling all my stuff down there. And they're all, hey, we want, we know that you know about fertilizer and stuff like that. Please, instruct us. And I'm going to all this trouble. And, in the interim, he says, well, look, I'll ship you the best of what I've got now just to get the pipeline started. And at this point, I had, significant connections back east with, as I explained, through Richard and through all these people. And he says, let's open the pipeline up and I'll ship to your buyers in New York and I'll ship you the best of what I have now. Some lime green Michoacan, and we'll get that up to New York. And so we do. And Bifocal Bob is even impressed with what I'm sending at this stage. And then the first skunk buds start showing up. And they're neatly packaged in these boxes, cardboard boxes that are lined with plastic. And they have the perfect tops all laid out. And I showed them how to manicure. They didn't really know. And they're producing outstanding weed. So regular quality Mexican selling for about $400 or $500, $400 a pound, something like that. And by the time it gets to New York, it's $800, something like that. And we're selling these in New York for 14. And people are falling over themselves to pay whatever. That's wholesale. So people are falling over themselves to pay whatever. It's probably going out at $2,000 to the minor wholesalers. But there are so many hands it goes through in New York. It's crazy, the supply chain. So I dropped this load out to Bifocal Bob. He stages us, as I told you, in Westchester County at the Howard Johnson. Then we come in to his Manhattan warehouse, pull right in, and unload like 4 tons of weed. And it gets packaged up. And later that night, I'm staying in a nice hotel next to the Golden Gate Park, and I'm walking outside. This guy comes up to me. He's like, weed.
Central Park?
Central Park. Sorry. Too many parks.
You were just traveling across the country.
No, Central Park. It was the Helmsley Central Park. That's where I was saying. And this guy comes up to me. He's like, weed. And I'm like, weed? Oh, let me see what you got. And he shows me the weed I just brought. So in the matter of like less than 24 hours, every bit that I brought was already on the street, already being sold. And there is quite a markup between, boxes of weed and little tiny, half, joint size, eighths, whatever they're selling on the street for, there's quite a markup by the time it gets down to that level. And New Yorkers have no problem paying it. For sure.
How much was that guy asking for that came up to you?
I think it was $25, $35 for like a couple of buds. It was like really expensive, but New Yorkers were
into a little dime bag.
Yeah, in his pocket, and he's got a whole pocket full of this stuff, and like right next to him are it's like this whole marketplace walking along the street in New York. There's these prostitutes. They're all, hey, you want a good time, and there's weed, and it's just like this whole red light district right next to the finest hotels, right? And so things are working pretty well, and I'm spending a lot of time in New York. I'm loving it. I'm going to all the best music in the world. I'm kind of a jazz aficionado, so I'm seeing the most notable people in jazz night after night. My routine was wake up, go for a jog in New York, in Golden Gate Park, come back. Central Park, sorry. And go for a jog in Central Park, come back.
any chance, were you jogging around Sheep's Meadow at the time?
Yes, exactly.
That's still the spot today.
Yeah.
Sheep's Meadow is a famous location.
And I'm like, this is so cool. I'm just loving this. And then for lunch, I'm going to like some of the best restaurants in the world. I go to this place, Il Molino, and it's in the village, and it looks just like a storefront, and I go in there, and it's like the best Italian food I've ever had in my life. Unbelievable. They bring around, this cart with smoked mussels and tomatoes and little crusts of bread, and the owner comes out, and he's all decked. He says, I'm making little sandwiches out of it. He says, where did you learn to do that? And he says, that's just the way we do it where I'm from in Rome. And we become friends, and he's given me olive oil. And I go to this place at night, and it's a mafia hangout. And limousines are coming in, and it's Friday night, so they're bringing the girlfriends on Friday night and the wives on Saturday night. It's straight out of Goodfellas, So I'm
connected with the Mexican cartel, and in New York, you're with the Italian mob.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so great. I'm having so much fun. All this, music, everything else. And I get a call from Brian in El Paso. He's real somber. So look, get a copy of the El Paso Times. And I said, where am I going to do that? Just get a copy. And I knew at the public library, New York Public Library, they have like every paper in the United States. So I get a cab, I go to the New York Public Library, and I find the El Paso Times. And there's a headline on it. It says, I thought I was going to die. And I swear the text was like this big. It was the whole first half of the paper, the whole above the fold. And it shows a guy, and he's tied up in a chair, and he's got a bag over his head, artist rendering of a guy, not a photograph. And it says, I thought I was going to die. And I start reading this. And this guy it's my guy, Granius, who picked him up. He went to take photographs and notes of the new high-rise building that Granius was building in downtown Juarez. And Granius, smoking all this bass, he looks out the window, and he's kind of paranoid. He says, go get that guy and bring him up here. I don't know why he's taking pictures and writing notes about my building. And so the henchmen bring him up there, and they beat him up, put a bag over his head, scare the shit out of him, take his camera, and then today they would have just killed him. No problem, Back then, they took him out and they just left him in the desert. He wandered back. He was a reporter for the El Paso Times, and they were doing a story on Granius, right? And suddenly this becomes an international incident. Bush stops the traffic across the border right then and there, declares the drug war, like a new drug war. And so I'm fond of saying my friends and I started the drug war. So every car that's coming across is getting checked. Everything stops. The U.S. leans on the Mexican government and says, pick this guy up. So they pick him up. And I'm reading all this, and I'm freaking out. And I call Brian, and he says, it's not as bad as you might think. Actually, it just moves us up the chain. Now we're going to have a meeting with the head of the Guadalajara cartel, Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, and Rafael Caro Quintero, guys who were depicted in Narcos Mexico, if you've seen that series. Mm-hmm. Gallardo was...
You should.
And if you haven't, you'll need to sort of follow some of the rest of what's happening. Because it's pretty accurate. That series is quite accurate. I don't know about... Huh?
Except you're not in it.
No, fortunately. I get to tell my own story. They kind of kept it... I was an asset that they kind of kept hushed up, And so Brian tells me, look, catch the next plane back to El Paso. We're gonna go meet with Gallardo, and we've moved up the chain, and everything's just going to be better. And I'm like, wow, this is cool. So I fly back, and we drive way out into the middle of the...
I gotta ask you one question.
Mm-hmm.
After the last guy, and I know he was a reporter, he got roughed up, and now you're going to meet like the even bigger bigwigs. Were you ever like? Were you scared? Or you're like, oh, this is cool. Like, you never even a moment you're thinking these guys can kill me at any moment.
People ask me that all the time, and I got to tell you, I was treated like an asset. A very special, highly regarded asset. They would protect me all kinds of ways. When we first started going with Greñas, we got this call, and he says, meet my lieutenant who's in charge of security in Juarez before you come to see me. This was when I was demonstrating the packaging machines, how to use them. He had a setup in the driveway of some tract house in Juarez, and we were bagging up bales of alfalfa to demonstrate to his crew how to work these packaging machines. And he said, before you do that, stop and see my head of security, Paco. And so I go to meet Paco, and this guy is like huge guy, jail tattoos, obviously done serious time in Mexico. And we go to his house, and we go inside. He says, sit down, in his living room. And he's got like 20 bolts on the door. Close this, chain this, another bolt, dead bolt here, another dead bolt here. I'm like, what is this guy expecting, right? And he says, look, the boss wants you to have this identification while you're in Mexico. It identifies you as Mexican Narcotics Police. And he whipped out this identification. There's my picture, badge, everything, paperwork, everything. I am suddenly an officer in the DFS, one of the most feared police agencies in Mexico. He says, present this identification, and no matter what the situation is, you're in charge. And I said, does it make any difference that my Spanish might not be exactly perfect, or if there's an accent? And none of that. He laughed. None of that makes any difference. And does it make any difference? I had blonde hair then. That I don't look Mexican. None of that matters. Here's your identification. Your Mexican Narcotics Judicial Police, right? So I was like taken care of. I was insulated. They didn't want anything to happen to me. So it gave me maybe a false sense of security. So to get back to, we're driving out into the desert in Chihuahua, and we hit this Rancho Las Palmas, out in the middle of nowhere. Drive up this dirt road, and there's these guys sitting around listening to narco corridos. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but they're a Mexican banda style of music that celebrates the activities of narcotraficantes or drug traffickers, and their wins, and they're kind of basically celebrated as heroes. They act as Robin Hood. They hold these big festivals. They give people money. If your kid is sick, you go to them. They give you some, make sure that he gets taken care of. They're basically revered, And these guys are listening to these ballads, and there's a shrine to I'm drawing a blank on the name of the saint, but it's the narco saint. And you pray to this guy for success in drug trafficking, basically. And there's a little shrine set up to him. Oh, Jesus Malverde. Okay, so they've got playing on the boombox. Just picture this is mis tres animales, my three animals, referring to the three contraband drugs of the Mexican narcotic supply: cocaine, marijuana, and heroin, performed by Los Tucanes de Tijuana. And El Señor de Cielos, the Lord of the Skies, referring to Amado Carrillo Fuentes by the singers Las Pueblas del Rancho, and Cuerno de Chiva, the goat's horn, a song about the goat's horn. That's slang for an AK-47 rifle by Los Huracanes del Norte. So I'm listening to this music, and I look around. There's the shrine to Jesus Malverde. He's also considered the angel of the poor, and he was like a Robin Hood figure who stole from the rich and gave to the poor. And he's actually venerated by Roman Catholics, and it became associated with protection and miracles, and basically for those involved in illicit activities. His grave in Culiacan is attended by thousands who like candles. And there's also all these smaller Jesus Malverde shrines throughout Mexico and in the United States. And I walked over and lit a candle. I was like, might as well make sure, at all levels that things are good. And I'm lighting a candle. I'm there with Brian and his Mexican partner, Charlie. And Brian says, hey, look, off in the distance, there's this like little cloud of dust off in the distance. And as it starts coming toward us, I see it's an entourage of like 10 black SUVs. I can't tell what kind of model, but these black SUVs are driving up. All 11 drive up next to the house here, and they form like a circle. And then driving into the middle is the SUV with the boss of bosses, El Padrino de los Padrinos, Miguel Gallardo. And he steps out of the car, and he's dressed in this Savile Row suit, like the head of a Fortune 500 company. And he's got, gold cufflinks, gold roll. I mean, he is decked, right? And, he nods to me, shakes my hand, but he has a lawyer who translates. Even though I speak Spanish, he's got a lawyer who does his translating, and he kind of acts as a buffer in discussions. And he says, just that we start the conversations. He says, Senor Gallardo appreciates all the excellent work you're doing on our cannabis operations, and we want to continue with that. I could tell you the whole history of Gallardo, but we don't have time for that right now. But at some point, he's a very interesting figure. And so we're chatting, and the lawyer says to me, because of, your excellent work, Senor Gallardo knows that you also have a background in chemistry and chemical process engineering. And he would like to ask you if you would do a favor for him. And I'm all, anything for Senor Gallardo. And he says, we are receiving cocaine from Colombia that is of very poor quality. And we need to process it into a much higher quality. Senor Gallardo wants to create a facility to do this in Durango, in a very large-scale facility. Is that something that you could help us design, build, and, show us how to operate? And, I'm sitting there thinking to myself, I mean, there's one other matter that Senor Gallardo would like your assistance with, and all these thoughts are racing through my mind. Like, I just came here to fucking grow marijuana. I did not come here to do this, right? But I knew that Felix Gallardo was not someone who would take being turned down very well. And so this was kind of my opportunity to kind of close the deal on my value. And I thought to myself, I could walk away from the project before it attracts attention. I just show them how to, put SOPs in place and just set it all up. So I stood up and I held out my hand. I said, Senor Gallardo, I'm at your service. And so then I built the largest cocaine reprocessing plant imaginable in Durango. And there's some great stories there. I learned a lot about cocaine and the various species of coca from which the extract is derived. There are only 2 of 17 species that are successfully cultivated, and there's one particular that is desirable because it has the highest alkaloid content. I could go into a real disquisition on cocaine botany at this point. It's harvested by.
That for another podcast.
Yeah.
Because the thing is that I don't want you to speed through it. Either you want to just tell us the whole thing, or we'll have to save it for later. Because...
it's so interesting to me, and I would love to tell you all about it. But this facility he had selected was on the outskirts of Durango, and several large industrial buildings. It had a large mess hall, multi-story building that was the designated location for the commercial laboratory, and a small army of his most trusted employees provided security, along with multiple payoffs to the Mexican army, police agencies, politicians. And Durango is located, it's the capital city of the state of Durango, and it's located in this dusty, dry region in the Sierra Madre Occidental mountain range. And it's beautiful area, actually, some of it. And it has always been an area known for its resistance to authority. And perhaps that's why they picked it. It has a long history in the Mexican War of Independence. There's Porfirio Diaz and Carranza had strong ties. Revolutionary leaders had strong ties to them. So when I saw the laboratory that he proposed, I made a huge list of everything I was going to need that he would get from his German suppliers. And that's when I became acquainted with the fact that he had these German suppliers, kind of like in Breaking Bad, where they showed these German suppliers. He had all these businesses that were agricultural, and whether you know it or not, a lot of the same chemicals that are used to make pesticides, the precursor chemicals. So there was an easy process of layering purchase of these chemicals so that nobody could figure out what it was being used for. So I started, listing, dozens of high volume roto evaporators, giant custom glass vessels, grinders, pulverizers, mixing tanks, just commercial scale. And I developed the operating procedures that would look at the product, figure out, what would be the next steps. Some of it had to be cleaned up before you could even reconstitute it, because eventually I would reconstitute it back into base, and then eventually the final product was essentially pharmaceutical. There is one thing I will tell you about. When in the process, you add hydrochloric acid to precipitate the cocaine out of solution. And if you add it too quickly, it turns into a dull powder, boom, like that. But if you swirl, and I started doing this like in Erlenmeyer flasks to figure it out, and then scaled it to giant size. But you swirl the Erlenmeyer, and you swirl the other Erlenmeyer with the acid solution in it, and you slowly pour them together. It turns into the most beautiful flake. This iridescent snowflakes appear, and they layer up, different from the dull, dusty powder if you just pour it in, and the reaction takes place too quickly. So that was actually quite revolutionary. And I set up these giant vessels that would titrate in the acid solution slowly enough to create this beautiful pharmaceutical grade cocaine. So, I hate doing a bad job. So, this story has some twists and turns, and we've kind of started a thread here, and I'll just take it to a certain place, okay? While I'm there, fumes, everything. There's a couple of really funny things that happened. One thing is I had this guy working for me who I kept telling him there was a water heater. And I said, before we start anything, turn the pilot light off on that water heater. We can't have any flames in the lab. Clean up the glassware, turn off the pilot light, okay? I don't even want it on in the same building. And I had this chemical feed from upstairs, and this guy had used tubing, the wrong tubing to construct it, and it was tubing that wasn't rated for acetone, which I used as a solvent and part of the process. And the tubing started swelling and getting bigger, and of course the guy left the pilot light on, and the tubing swelled into this giant expansion, and the guy walks over there and goes, "¿Qué es esto?" And he pokes it. It explodes, pours all the solvent out on the floor, heads straight over to the pilot light. Suddenly I've got giant flames in front of me, 30 feet high in this giant industrial building. It's connected to hundreds of 55-gallon drums of solvent that are on the second floor, right? And it's starting to burn up the tubing to the second floor. I grab the first fire extinguisher I see. I try to put it out, and the fire extinguisher doesn't work. And I'm like, he gets me, and we go outside. And he says, man, we just got to walk away. Just let the thing blow up. And I said, nothing's blowing up on my watch. So I go back in there, and this is what's really funny. When I had been working with Alexander Shulgin, when I had successfully done some synthesis processes, he gave me this fire extinguisher, which was like this big 4-foot tall fire extinguisher. He says, this is your symbol of you having graduated. You are now an underground chemist, and I give this to you to have in all your underground chemistry labs. And I brought the thing with me, right? And I had it there sitting in a corner, and it hadn't been used. I hadn't even looked at it for years, right? And I saw it, and here these flames are getting out of control. I went over, pulled the pin on it, turned it toward the fire, and the force of it was knocked me over almost. The fire was out in seconds.
Wow. That's crazy.
The guy who, so Shulgin saved my ass there. The guy who was, watching this disappeared into Durango. I never saw him again because he was just like, what are the repercussions from this? I'm just leaving. It messed up maybe, a kilo of coke or something. Nothing serious in the scheme of things. So I'm in a pharmacy in Durango because I had a headache from everything that had happened. And I'm looking at headache tablets you can buy over the counter in Mexico. And what I come across is something they sell over the counter in Mexico called Cofal ergotamina, which is essentially aspirin with ergotamine tartrate. Ergotamine tartrate, if you don't know, is a vasoconstrictor that constricts your blood vessels like caffeine so that it reduces headache pain. And, couple it with aspirin, which is anti-inflammatory, and, you have a pretty effective headache medication. Well, I knew that ergotamine tartrate was also the main precursor for LSD, and it is impossible to get. You even ask about it, you're going to jail. It was so restricted, unbelievably restricted, because that was what you needed at that time. That was the synthesis route that everybody used. And so I went to my cartel friends and I said, hey, by the way, could you get, there's 55-gallon drums of this sitting around somewhere where they manufacture this. You guys think you could get me that chemical? And they said, well, of course we can get it for you. And we can get that for you and any other precursor chemicals that you might need. So an idea started forming in my pea brain. These guys can get me all the precursor chemicals I need to make LSD. And wow, that sounds like a good idea. We'll redirect the cartel a little bit away from cocaine and towards LSD. And so I set about acquiring those precursor chemicals. And
I have to ask, what year about was this?
This was in the mid 80s. Okay. And so I started acquiring more and more chemicals. I told them, look, I need to get a huge volume. I calculated what I would need for everyone in the world, and then I multiplied it times 4. So I had enough precursor chemicals. It's not as much as you might think because it's, quite concentrated, but still quite a bit. And started to assemble enough LSD chemicals for everyone in the world 4 times over. And I resolved, there's a lot of lab technique involved with making LSD. It's quite difficult. What you may see on the street oftentimes is a soup of isomers that have a very unfocused effect. It's not LSD 25, which requires several purification steps that are occasionally omitted. So I resolved I'm going to make the best LSD anybody's ever seen, because I grew up on Owsley LSD, right? And so assemble all this, smuggle it across the border, and using, again, old man George and part of his crew, one of his friends who was a tugboat captain in New York, they drive it all the way up to San Francisco, and I find a storage facility at the airport in Novato. And I actually had, it was like a double size, huge storage facility. And so I started stocking all these chemicals in there, and I set up a laboratory, state-of-the-art laboratory, and I started making proof of concept batches, trying to make the best LSD I could possibly make. And I figured I'd store it in thermal containers that were packed with nitrogen, so there would be no degradation. And I'd bury, I'd make it, and then I'd bury a whole bunch, and then I would just pull out what I needed over time, and I'd bury it in different places. And I just had this whole plan, of how I was going to supply LSD to everyone. And, I was still thinking at that time that LSD would fuel a social revolution in America. This is just what America needs. So now I'm starting to make these batches, and it's coming out really good, really, really good. And I'm just going to take this story up to this point. I had a friend who was working with me, who was actually the guy who I had worked with on the mushroom project, who watered my mushrooms for me. He wasn't extremely knowledgeable, but he thought I needed a particular chemical that I didn't need. And he went to the East Bay, to a chemical supply house in the East Bay to get it. Turns out that chemical supply house was a DEA sting, and it had been set up to catch people trying to acquire methamphetamine precursors. And he got this, and he used fake ID to get it. So that set off a red flag, even though they hadn't been looking for this particular chemical. And they followed him. And he took his chemical back to my storage facility. And they followed him back to my storage facility. And I think it was, several days later, I went to check on the chemicals in the storage facility, and they were all gone. Wow. Everything was gone. And my friend, I was calling him, he's nowhere to be found. And I noticed that the only thing in the storage is a Post-it note. And it says, "This is the DEA. Get a hold of us." And it had a phone number. And that was it. So now I'm sitting there thinking, well, if I have to assume that they know me, or, that they've investigated enough to trace this to me, I just assume the worst. So I said, I'm either going on the run right now with whatever money I have, and I was rolling pretty good at that point. I either go on the run, or I lawyer up and go talk to these guys. So I got the best lawyers in San Francisco and went to talk to them. And I met them at one of the law offices of one of the lawyers I had. I had like two of the best lawyers in San Francisco. I won't mention their names. They've since both passed on. Really great guys, incredible, both of them. And one of them was a former federal prosecutor, and that's whose office I met at. And so I'm sitting there waiting, and this crew shows up from the DEA. It's a tax guy, a couple DEA agents, and these guys are super low level, and they're like astonished. They have no idea what to do with any of this. And one of the guys that's with them is this asshole who starts trying to tell me that, you're going to jail for 50 years. You're never going to see the light of day. He actually started pacing off the dimensions of the cell that I was going to be in, just to show me how big the cell was. This group was suddenly, another group showed up. and they were superseded by a much larger group. And this group was composed of a judge, top-level DEA, FBI, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, Justice Department people, and it was led by a judge. So if they needed a search warrant, they had a judge in tow that they could just write a search warrant if they wanted to. So here's this high-level group, and they lean in, and the other group leaves. And they said, well, we have done some research on who you are, and we think you can help us with a very difficult situation that we're having. There's a guy on the border that you know. He's the nephew of Rafael Talavera, who's a cartel figure. And he's a psychopathic killer. And he's killing all these people on the border, starting cycles of revenge where hundreds of people are killed. And, he is being tried in absentia in the United States. And a Border Patrol agent is testifying against him. This guy's made a threat on that Border Patrol agent's life and his family and other people in the office in El Paso. And we take these threats very seriously. This guy is a menace. He's a psychopathic killer. And I knew the guy really well. And I knew his uncle even better. In fact, I had worked with him, and he had used our warehouse on occasion. And I said, well, first of all, they said, yeah, we want to confirm that you're looking at 50 years to life. There's just no getting around it. And they said, but, you know this guy. And I said, well, yeah, I know him. What can I possibly do to help? And so the judge, who was kind of leading the discussion, leans forward in his chair. This guy's dressed like, white hat, belt buckle, like a Texas Ranger, leans forward in his creaky chair and says, well, Dale, we'd like you to kidnap him. So got my posse together. We kidnapped him.
Shit.
That's part 2.
We'll have to go into that more next time.
I'm afraid
Wow.
So. Hey,
that is a wonderful story so far.
Unbelievable story, and we can't just cliffhang it like that. We gotta come back and try to finish some of these stories because that's.
I will tell you that the story gets much crazier from here.
And you're writing a book, I assume?
Yes, I just finished it, and I'm actually working with an editor. We're hoping for a release in spring. I'm toying with all these different titles. And my wife favors It Was a Different Time, because I always say that. It was a different time. It was a different time. Subtitle, Chronicles of a Psychedelic Pioneer in the Reign of the Cartels. And since then, my editor said, look, you have all these other stories that didn't make it into the book. Go ahead and write those stories up. She started reading those stories, and she's like, God, we got to put these in. So now the book is going to be much larger, and I'm going to filter in all these other stories, which are independently equally hair-raising and interesting, thrilling. But I want you guys to understand that, getting weed wasn't what it was today. You didn't go to a dispensary and buy an eighth of weed. You imported it from Colombia, from Thailand, and each one of these places, the name would elicit all these notions of quality and, style and everything else. And, it was like kind of a international supermarket. And in that environment, there was also psychedelics, cocaine, a little bit here and there, not quite as much, but primarily cannabis. And, a lot of it was centered in the Bay Area. The earliest Thai weed kind of came in through the Bay Area. And I have some good stories there as well. But, pretty much I've got an 11 o'clock, so maybe we should stop.